Hey there and welcome back to my channel. In this video, we're going to look at the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which was established in 1904. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, then let's get to it. Well, that was a policy established in 1823 by President James Monroe, who essentially told European powers that they weren't allowed to colonize or interfere with any of the nations in the Americas. And there were two main reasons for this. First, because it was increasingly obvious that the era of European colonialism was coming to a close. Navy on a world tour to make sure that Americans could say Mare Nostrum with a straight face. If any nation in the Western Hemisphere is unwilling or unable to meet its international obligations, i.e. can't pay its debts, or to protect the rights of citizens of the United States, or to safeguard our extensive interests in the region, then the United States will intervene in that country to restore order and protect American interests. So in essence, Roosevelt took the Monroe Doctrine, which was intended to keep Europe out of the Americas, and turned it into a justification for the United States to get involved in the affairs of its neighbors to the south. Before 1900, the U.S. had intervened in only 3 sovereign nations in the Western Hemisphere, all of which happened before the purchase of Alaska. For example, in 1904, the U.S. sent the Navy to Santo Domingo to force the government to pay back its European creditors. Many people in the region felt that the U.S. was simply using the Monroe Doctrine as a way to justify its own expansionist goals and protect its own interests. And the Caribbean, it also led to a loss of sovereignty in the region. And hey, if you want me to keep making these videos, then subscribe and I shall oblige. I'm out. Many Latin American and Caribbean nations felt that the U.S. was encroaching on their territory and interfering in their affairs, which undermined their ability to govern themselves. And so the Roosevelt Corollary contributed to a general instability in the region that lasted for decades. And so the Roosevelt Corollary led to a general anti-Americanism throughout the region. Additionally, since the U.S. military was often involved in putting down rebellions and installing friendly governments, many Latin Americans felt that the U.S. was undermining their own efforts to achieve independence and establish democratic institutions. And so the Roosevelt Corollary led to a loss of faith in the United States as a champion of democracy in the Western Hemisphere. But once the sailors arrived, it soon became obvious that they couldn't really leave until they also restored order and protected American businesses. And so the U.S. essentially occupied the Dominican Republic for 4 years while they set up a new government that could repay their debts. But during the first half of the 20th century alone, the U.S. sent its military to put down rebellions, insurrections, coups d'etat and revolutions no less than 17 times in Latin America and the Caribbean. And not only were there more interventions, but they were much more aggressive. For example, in 1912, the U.S. sent troops to Haiti to put down a rebellion which resulted in the establishment of a brutal U.S. occupation that lasted for 19 years. Or in 1927, the U.S. sent Marines to Nicaragua to protect American business interests, which led to an 8-year occupation. Or in Cuba in 1912 and again in 1918, the U.S. sent in troops to keep the newly independent island from becoming a communist state. And just like that, the good old U.S. went from being a relatively isolationist republic to becoming an interventionist world power. And so when a revolution broke out in the Dominican Republic in 1903, which resulted in the establishment of a brutal dictatorship, well, the U.S. sent in Marines. Well, for one thing, as I said earlier, Roosevelt was something of an expansionist and interventionist himself. And so he sought to use the Monroe Doctrine as a way of expanding American influence throughout the Western Hemisphere. Secondly, many Americans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries believed in something called the civilizing mission, which was the idea that it was the God-given duty of the United States to bring Christianity, democracy, and capitalism to the rest of the world. And so they felt justified in intervening in the affairs of other nations to impose their own brand of government and economics on them. And finally, many Americans felt that intervening in the affairs of Latin American and Caribbean nations was absolutely necessary to protect the vast amount of American investments in the region. You see, in the decades following the Spanish-American War, American businessmen had been pouring money into the economies of Latin America and the Caribbean. And so the U.S. government felt a sense of responsibility to intervene and ensure that these investments were protected. And when a group of disgruntled Venezuelans came to the U.S. asking for our support in overthrowing their dictator, Roosevelt simply said, "No, you stay out of here." Then later on in his second term, he decided that the best way to ensure that the Monroe Doctrine actually accomplished something would be to add a little corollary, which is basically a cute little word for saying something in addition. And so in 1904, Roosevelt articulated what became known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. All the colonies in North America had become independent republics, and most of the countries in South America had broken away from Portuguese and Spanish control. And so the idea of European powers establishing new colonies in the Western Hemisphere was pretty much out of the question. Second, even if European powers wanted to try establishing colonies in the Americas, they were simply too far away to make that a viable option. And so the Monroe Doctrine established that any attempt to do so would be seen as a hostile act against the United States. Okay, so first of all, what is the Monroe Doctrine? It did nothing to prevent the United States from getting involved in the affairs of nations in the Western Hemisphere. In fact, as we saw in an earlier video, the Monroe Doctrine didn't even include Central America or the Caribbean, which were chock full of U.S. economic interests. However, the problem with the Monroe Doctrine from an American perspective was that while it successfully discouraged European colonization and interference in the Americas, now, President Theodore Roosevelt was something of an expansionist. He built the Panama Canal, for crying out loud, and he sent the U.S. and here's what it said. But why did Roosevelt think it was such a great idea to turn the Monroe Doctrine into a rationale for interventionism? Okay, so now that we've answered the question of why the U.S. adopted the Roosevelt Corollary, let's turn our attention to the question of how this new policy affected the Western Hemisphere. Well, for one thing, the Roosevelt Corollary led to a significant increase in the number of U.S. military interventions in Latin America and the Caribbean. And while it's true that the U.S. military was often involved in putting down rebellions and restoring order, it wasn't always clear who exactly was calling the shots. However, perhaps the greatest consequence of the Roosevelt Corollary was that it created deep resentment among the people of Latin America and the Caribbean toward the United States. Finally, since the Roosevelt Corollary led to a significant increase in the number of U.S. military interventions in Latin America, okay, that's what we need to know about the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine.